Hello and welcome to Web Development 101 with Alex Merced. On this show, we'll talk about all the basic concepts of web development in a way that anyone can understand, whether it's front-end web development, back-end web development, and full-stack web development. If you're new to web development, I recommend listening from episode 1 to understand all the concepts from beginning to end. You can also learn more about my own personal projects over there at alexmercedcoder.com. Thank you. Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and this week's episode of the Web Development Podcast is going to be talking about the .NET framework. So .NET is a framework created by Microsoft. It's a very popular framework, especially with a lot of large enterprise sort of web applications, intranets, that kind of thing. Now, what makes .NET kind of different is that it's really it's full stack, not down to the web server. So it has its own web server, and the whole framework can be done in there's three main languages that it's sort of built around, or the libraries are sort of accessible to. So that's C#, F#, and VB.NET. VB.NET being sort of the successor to Visual Basic. If you learned Visual Basic back in like the 90s and 80s. Well, really learned the basic in the 80s, Visual Basic in the 90s, and I guess VB.NET in modern times. But you could learn either one of those three languages and create .NET applications. And just like any kind of other MVC framework, allows you to configure databases, create APIs, do all that stuff with the level of sort of tools that Microsoft would provide, because it's such a robust, huge enterprise. So that's pretty cool, okay? It's very popular among bigger companies. So if you're looking for a job, .NET's a great framework for looking for a job at bigger companies. But keep in mind that also the issue with bigger companies is that they're going to be more picky about qualifications. So you might be a really good .NET developer, but you may not have that computer science degree. So, HR may not bring you in for an interview, versus medium to small companies, it's going to be more about sort of your portfolio, your experience, less necessarily about whether you went to college or not. Just because, again, things just become more bureaucratic with bigger companies. So just keep that in mind, but doesn't mean there aren't medium to small companies that use the .NET framework, but it does take some time to learn because there's a lot of moving parts. Like, I have dabbled with the .NET framework. I haven't really gone too deep into it yet, as I've learned C# a while ago, and I've dabbled with C++, so you can actually use C and C++ as well. But what's interesting is that they've taken sort of the .NET, sort of the Windows runtime environment. And what a runtime environment is, just means it's running your code in the moment. So instead of compiling your code, it's translating your code. So there's the Java virtual machine that has been popular. So that was the whole idea with Java. So the idea that you code once, run anywhere. So because you'd always just run it in the virtual machine. So whether you're on Windows, Mac, mobile, whatever, you'd always just run the Java code in the Java virtual machine, so it works anywhere. The .NET framework has its own sort of virtual machine made by Windows. And what they've done recently with the whole WebAssembly thing, as I mentioned in the WebAssembly episode, is that they created the Blazor framework, which will allow you to create code through the .NET framework that instead of, having to run a Windows web server, you could actually just compile it to WebAssembly, which opens up all sorts of new doors for the use of the .NET framework. But in this intermediate step, so basically right now, the Blazor compiler doesn't necessarily compile to WebAssembly yet. What they've done is they've compiled that sort of Windows runtime environment into WebAssembly. So that way the runtime environment can run on a web server, fairly lightweight, and then you could run .NET code in that runtime for someone else to have their internet experience, which I thought was pretty interesting. So right now, Blazor is in the early stages, but chances are, if you're looking into getting in on sort of the ground floor of WebAssembly and get into the .NET framework, Blazor seems like a really good way to go. It's probably the furthest along in really kind of implementing the promise of WebAssembly, and also using a framework that people are already familiar with. So that's something definitely to check out. So I want to talk about that this week. That's the .NET framework from Microsoft. Again, C#, F#, VB.NET are the programming languages if you want to know what language to learn to get started in that framework. But that's sort of the synopsis. I'll talk to you guys later on. Have a great day and enjoy.